Deep in the hollers of West Virginia, where dirt roads curl like veins through the mountains, there's a family whose name carries both fear and fascination: the Whitakers. To most of the world, they are nothing more than a viral oddity, the faces behind a screen that provoke laughter, shock, or pity. But here's the thing: those short clips barely scratch the surface. What if I told you their story is bigger than a meme, darker than a rumor, and more tragic than any headline ever dared to show? Their lives are a mirror, reflecting how society treats those it doesn't understand. A burned-out home, a bloodline tangled in ways scientists still study, a fortress guarded with rifles, and voices that aren't madness, but a coded language born of survival. This is not just the tale of America's most inbred family. It's a story of men bound by blood, betrayal, resilience, and secrets so haunting you'll question everything you thought you knew. Before we step further into the Whitakers world, take a second to hit like and subscribe. Not just because it helps the channel, but because what you're about to witness deserves to be seen in its full depth. Not skimmed, not skipped. And hey, drop a comment at the end. What shocked you most about this family's story? I'll be reading every word. Now, settle in, because once we start peeling back these layers, there's no turning back. In the hills of Appalachia, whispers lingered of a family unlike any other. Whispers that stretched back through generations. The Whitakers' name carried with it shadows, rumors, and a mystery that no outsider ever fully grasped. The story began not with poverty, nor with isolation, but with a strange twist of bloodlines. Two identical twin brothers, Henry and John Perkins Whitaker, were the seeds of something science rarely encounters, a paradox waiting to unfold. Identical twins are more than lookalikes. They are carbon copies of one another's DNA. In essence, Henry and John were genetic mirrors, two men carrying identical blueprints, indistinguishable in every measurable sense of biology. Now imagine the consequences when their sons, cousins by name but half-brothers by blood, married and produced children. Most families frown upon cousin unions, but this was not cousins in the ordinary sense. It was something far more extreme. Gracie Irene Whitaker and John Emery Whitaker were born of these mirrored lines. They weren't simply cousins. They were linked by the same genetic core, making their union closer in nature than half-siblings. The children that resulted from their marriage bore the invisible weight of this collapse. 15 sons arrived into a world already tilted against them, carrying a genetic burden so rare it startled even seasoned researchers. In most dynasties, genetic decline happens slowly, a subtle fraying of the rope across centuries. But here it was sudden, catastrophic. The Whitaker bloodline snapped inward on itself, producing consequences both visible and unseen. Some of the sons grew up able to speak, to laugh, to work. Others struggled with words, relying instead on sounds, gestures, and grunts that outsiders mistook for madness. In truth, it was survival. Imagine being born into a language no one else spoke, a code that only your brothers understood. Every cry, every sound carried meaning, a way of existing in a world already hostile to your presence. Outsiders, quick to mock, saw only the surface. Viral videos turned these men into caricatures. But behind the guttural sounds and staring eyes was the mark of generations colliding in a storm of fate. The collapse wasn't gradual like in Europe's royal houses. It was immediate, brutal, and undeniable. When Henry and John's mirrored DNA converged, it was like stacking two identical maps. Errors doubled, vulnerabilities magnified, outcomes distorted. Science explains it with percentages. Normal cousins share about 12% of DNA. But when descended from identical twins, that number doubles. Suddenly, children are born not as distant relatives, but as genetic half-brothers. That doubling effect ripped through the Whitaker family. The inbreeding coefficient shot past half-sibling levels, teetering into territory most biologists never see outside of laboratory studies. It was a case study of collapse in real time. And yet, these were not statistics. They were sons, men who played in the dirt roads of odd West Virginia, who barked at stray dogs, who lived lives most of the world could never imagine. Isolation magnified the spiral. In odd, opportunities were scarce, connections scarce, and bloodlines tangled in knots. The Whitakers did not merely endure poverty, they endured genetic destiny, one written long before any of them were born. Locals spoke in hushed tones. They said the Whitakers were cursed, that their strangeness was punishment. But curses are superstition. What they carried was science's cold truth, a legacy of identical twins and cousin-brother unions. The collapse shaped everything. It determined who could speak, who could not. It defined who walked steadily and who shuffled. It decided which sons could hold jobs and which spent lives locked in silence. But still, there was resilience. These men survived in their way. Their communication system, strange to outsiders, was their bridge. Their brotherhood was unbreakable, even as their DNA carried fractures too deep to repair. Picture a house filled with voices no outsider could decode. To one man, a grunt meant yes. To another, a bark meant stop. To them, it was clarity. To strangers, it was chaos. Generations of Whitakers adapted to this private language. It was more than sound. It was trust, built over decades of surviving mockery, built on the understanding that their bloodline was both prison and shield. And yet, even among this brotherhood, there were moments of sorrow. Some of the sons recognized their difference. They knew the world saw them as less, and the weight of that judgment scarred deeply. One brother, standing in the yard, once told a filmmaker, "This is just who we are." In his eyes flickered defiance, not shame. It was a declaration, a claim to existence beyond ridicule. The origins of their condition weren't chosen. They were inherited, set in motion by two identical twins who could never have known the ripple effects their mirrored DNA would unleash across generations. It's easy to mock what you don't understand, but the Whitakers' story is not just tragedy. It's proof of how fragile the human blueprint can be, how quickly it unravels when chance and choice collide. Think about this. Royal dynasties intermarried for centuries before collapse showed. The Whitakers saw the same collapse happen in one generation, as if fate pressed fast forward on the unraveling of their family tree. Scientists studying consanguinity rarely find examples so extreme outside theory. The Whitakers became living proof, not by design, but by circumstance, of just how severe genetic overlap can cripple entire bloodlines almost overnight. But science alone cannot tell this story. Numbers don't capture the sound of a man barking to his brother, or the way their neighbors raised rifles to keep gawkers away from their porch. The Whitakers were both spectacle and fortress. Their very existence confused the outside world, yet to themselves their bloodline was not a curse. It was simply life, a reality they carried without choice. Every generation left scars. The 15 sons from Gracie and John Emery carried the brunt. Some managed with broken English. Others lived in silence, their voices replaced with sounds the world mistook for madness. The brothers' condition was not random chance. It was the unavoidable math of genetics. Identical twins at the root meant cousin marriages were no longer distant. It was like stacking mirrors until the reflection broke. The collapse was swift, undeniable, and permanent. Once set in motion, there was no undoing it. Each new son was born under the same shadow, his fate written in blood before he took breath. And yet, survival persisted. These men did not vanish into statistics. They farmed small patches, fixed old cars, walked dirt roads with loyal dogs at their side. They lived even as science marked them doomed. Their origin story was not one of choice. It was inheritance, the cruel lottery of blood. The Whitakers never asked to be born into mirrored DNA. They simply shouldered it, one generation after another. And so the legend of their bloodline grew. Outsiders pointed, mocked, and whispered. But those who knew them saw something else. Men who clung to family, who endured fire, poverty, and ridicule with stubborn resolve. Behind every viral clip was this deeper truth. The Whitakers were not monsters, not curiosities for the internet. They were the living consequence of a genetic twist so rare it reshaped an entire family's destiny. The beginning of their saga was not about barking sounds or strange stares. It was about two brothers, Henry and John, whose identical lives set in motion a chain reaction generations could never escape. The story of the Whitakers is not one of shame. It is one of survival against odds so severe that most bloodlines would have collapsed entirely. Somehow, through grit and bond, they carried on. And as we step further into their world, remember this. The bloodline is only the beginning. What followed was a story of defense, of fire, of language, and of men who refused to disappear quietly. The Whitakers lived in odd West Virginia, a town so small it barely registered on a map. Dirt roads wound into the hills, carrying whispers of a family who built walls stronger than stone. Their fortress wasn't made of steel or concrete. It was made of silence, suspicion, and rifles that leaned against door frames. Outsiders never entered without risk, because this family's world was protected with firepower. The first time a filmmaker ventured into Odd, he expected caution, but was greeted with hostility. A cousin named Jason stood at the edge of the property, a rifle raised, voice warning, eyes unflinching. That image defined the Whitakers' fortress. They were not passive victims of curiosity. They fought intrusion with steel, protecting their land like soldiers at a front line. Outsiders learned quickly, approach uninvited and face consequence. This defense did not rise overnight. It was born from years of harassment, from trucks rumbling down late at night, horns blaring, windows shattered by stones hurled by strangers daring each other for entertainment. Men inside the house grew tired of eggs cracking against siding, of taunts screamed from headlights. They endured too much, and so the rifles came out. Their silence turned into warning shots across trees. Neighbors joined their cause. Odd was not just geography, it was loyalty. Men nearby had seen the ridicule, the cruelty. They stepped forward as guardians, determined to shield the family from another decade of humiliation. It was not paranoia, it was survival. For men like the Whitakers, law enforcement rarely brought justice. The deputies shrugged, the state ignored, so defense was left to brothers, cousins, neighbors with loaded magazines. Imagine growing up with that knowledge. Outsiders saw you as spectacle, but your own brothers stood with weapons, forming a living wall. For every insult shouted, there was a barrel raised in response. Even filmmakers, the rare outsiders allowed inside, understood they walked into a fortress. Access was never given freely. Trust was earned slowly, built through return visits, small gestures, years of showing they meant no harm. The property itself became a symbol. Dilapidated homes leaned under Appalachian skies, but within those walls was security. The rifles weren't just weapons. They were a line in the dirt, a declaration of sovereignty. Outsiders called it hostile, but to the Whitakers, it was justice. They had endured the cruelty of being treated like animals for too long. A fortress of silence was their only true refuge. Each rifle was a reminder. This land belonged to them. Each stare from a cousin on the porch carried unspoken warning. The fortress was invisible to maps, but it was unbreakable to intruders. Odd was a town that learned to protect its own. Neighbors raised boys who understood the code. Never mock, never betray, and never let outsiders push past the tree line without permission. Generations of harassment etched scars too deep to fade. Broken windows left behind cold nights. Mocking horns echoed in their sleep. Each act hardened resolve until every man carried defiance in his silence. The fortress was not just physical, it was psychological. Strangers turned away not only because of rifles, but because of the unshakable feeling that this family could not be touched without consequence. The brothers became figures of legend. Some said their eyes could freeze you before a word left your mouth. Others claimed their dogs barked in ways that warned of outsiders long before footsteps arrived. Filmmakers recorded moments of guarded trust, yet even then the rifles lingered in the background, leaning against peeling door frames, a reminder that every word was spoken under the shadow of potential confrontation. Those rifles weren't just for show. Stories spread of warning shots fired into the trees when teenagers tried to sneak close. Outsiders fled, leaving headlights bouncing as laughter turned into fear. It wasn't violence for pleasure. It was necessity. These men had been pushed into the role of defenders because no one else came. In a way, their rifles replaced the protection society denied. This constant vigilance turned Odd into something unusual. A place outsiders couldn't simply invade. It was guarded by more than trees and ridges. It was guarded by men whose silence became their armor. Every visit from an outsider followed ritual. The first meeting was suspicion. The second, still guarded. Only after repeated patience would trust crack open, allowing rare glimpses into a world fiercely hidden from view. Imagine being part of such a family, knowing your life was watched, mocked, shared online, yet shielded by brothers with rifles at windows. That duality of exposure and protection defined the Whitakers' existence. Even when mocked globally, they remained rooted in Odd. Leaving meant vulnerability. Staying meant strength. Their fortress wasn't only about geography, it was about staying anchored where loyalty outweighed mockery. The rifles were symbols, yes, but so were the stares. Outsiders described being watched silently, the weight of those eyes pressing heavier than bullets. It was a fortress of presence, not just weaponry. Stories of confrontation traveled. Teenagers who once dared to harass never returned. Word spread quickly. The Whitakers did not hesitate to defend. Over time, the harassment slowed, replaced with a quiet, fearful respect. Odd transformed into a place outsiders entered at their own peril. A man could drive down the road, but the moment his tires touched gravel near the property, he was already trespassing. The fortress was never abandoned. Even after fires, poverty, and ridicule, the rifles remained. They symbolized endurance, proof that while their bloodline collapsed genetically, their defenses never faltered, never surrendered to humiliation. Inside those defenses, life carried on. Men gathered on porches, dogs lay at their feet, and silence hung thick. To them, this was normal. To outsiders, it was an impenetrable wall of mystery. The fortress wasn't only about repelling cruelty, it was about preserving dignity. Every trigger finger was a reminder that though mocked, they would not allow the world to strip away their humanity. Each rifle held history, each stare carried weight. Each silence spoke louder than any words could. The Whitakers weren't just surviving. They were guarding their existence, ensuring their story couldn't be stolen without resistance. Even when cameras captured them, they remained guarded. Trust was never absolute. Outsiders saw fragments of truth, but never the full story. The fortress ensured mystery, ensured secrecy, ensured power remained in their hands. Odd became less a town and more a myth. People spoke of the Whitakers like legend, half in fear, half in awe. The fortress was not just physical, it was cultural, woven into every whisper. What outsiders failed to see was that this fortress came at a cost. Isolation hardened them, mistrust thickened, and opportunities vanished. Yet they chose walls over vulnerability, rifles over betrayal, silence over shame. The men of Odd defended not only property, but identity. They refused to let their story be written by those who mocked. They carved it in silence, in rifles, in unyielding defiance against intrusion. As the years passed, the fortress grew stronger, its legend greater. Outsiders who once came for curiosity learned better. Few dared return. The rifles had spoken, and the fortress of Odd endured unbroken. When outsiders first saw the Whitakers on camera, the reaction was instant and cruel. Strange barks, guttural grunts, sharp cries, sounds that to the untrained ear seemed animalistic, proof of something broken, something less than human. Yet within those sounds existed meaning, a private code forged over decades of survival. This wasn't madness. It was language, stripped of conventional grammar but rich with intent. Each bark, each grunt carried messages understood only by brothers. A glance could mean reassurance. A twitch of the mouth could signal warning. Outsiders dismissed it as nonsense, but inside that house, those sounds were as clear as spoken words in any other family. Some brothers managed to speak broken English, piecing together words with effort. Others relied entirely on the code of sounds and gestures. Together they wove communication into a shield, a lifeline no outsider could decode. Imagine growing up where language was shaped not by classrooms but by survival. Imagine every sound you made being mocked, yet inside your world it held clarity, emotion, and connection as strong as any spoken sentence. The barking wasn't chaos. It was survival instinct. Outsiders might laugh at a grunt, but within the Whitakers' small circle, that grunt could mean approval, disapproval, or a subtle warning of danger lurking nearby. Experts suggested that genetic collapse heightened developmental conditions like severe nonverbal autism, but clinical terms missed the heart of it. To the Whitakers, this wasn't disorder. It was their way of existing, their bridge across silence. Communication developed naturally over years of isolation. Few outsiders visited. Fewer still stayed. Without external influence, the family shaped their own vocabulary, a mixture of noises, glances, and physical gestures that carried profound meaning inside their world. A grunt paired with a head nod might mean yes. A bark with a stiff posture could mean no. These codes created an ecosystem of meaning that outsiders could not begin to understand. The language bound them together. When cruelty from outsiders rained down, when rocks shattered windows and voices mocked from headlights, the Whitakers turned inward, relying on this private code to hold their brotherhood intact. It became a shield as much as a bridge. Outsiders couldn't mock what they couldn't interpret. The grunts sounded chaotic to strangers, but to the family, they carried nuance, jokes, arguments, and moments of comfort. One filmmaker, after years of observation, noticed patterns. Certain barks repeated in specific contexts. Certain cries matched emotional states. What outsiders laughed at were actually structured signals, evidence of language built within constraint. Inside those walls, a grunt might say, "Bring food." A bark might mean, "Stay out." Silence itself carried meaning, too, a pause heavy enough to signal rejection or disapproval without any word spoken. The code wasn't written, nor could it be translated easily. It was instinctual, lived daily, and refined through repetition. Each brother adapted, understood, and communicated in a way no outsider could ever master. For outsiders, it appeared alien. For the Whitakers, it was natural as breathing. Generations had passed using these sounds, embedding them into identity so deeply that losing them would mean losing themselves entirely. This language created resilience. In a world that mocked them, they retained control. Outsiders could ridicule, but they could never penetrate the code, never rob the Whitakers of the one thing wholly their own. Think about it. To be mocked for your voice, to be dismissed as animalistic, yet to hold in your voice the very key to brotherhood, survival, and meaning. That's defiance written in sound. This defiance resonated through their daily lives. A bark during dinner was not disorder. It was expression. A grunt during an argument wasn't noise. It was voice. Their sounds carried weight the world refused to hear. The tragedy is that outsiders never listened long enough to notice. Viral videos cut moments for spectacle, stripping away context. They didn't show how a single grunt could calm tension or express tenderness between brothers. Inside the home, those sounds meant everything. They weren't empty noises, they were connections woven from necessity. A sound might protect dignity or express anger or simply say, "I'm here," when silence weighed too heavily. The code offered protection from outsiders, too. Teenagers mocking from the road never realized the brothers communicated strategies with those sounds, warning each other, preparing defenses, ensuring survival through a language outsiders thought meaningless. In reality, the language revealed something profound: humanity's ability to adapt. When traditional speech failed, when genetics closed certain doors, the Whitakers carved another path, one uniquely their own, one outsiders had no key to. This resilience challenges perception. Outsiders saw deformity, but inside was creativity. Outsiders saw noise, but inside was code. Outsiders saw madness, but inside was meaning. The very definition of language born from isolation. The barking language to an outsider might sound haunting. To the brothers, it was comforting. Every sound anchored them to one another, kept loneliness at bay, and reaffirmed their connection in a world hostile to difference. Consider how remarkable that is. With no teachers, no linguists, no outside help, they built a shared communication system. They didn't collapse into silence. They adapted, creating a language as valid as any spoken tongue. To call it animalistic is to miss the point. The Whitakers proved that even when stripped of convention, the human drive to connect refuses to die. Their sounds were proof of endurance, not decline. It was, in many ways, a living rebellion. Against poverty, against mockery, against misunderstanding, their code shouted silently, "We exist, we endure, we communicate, even if you refuse to understand us." In that sense, the Whitakers' language was not broken. It was revolutionary. It allowed survival, unity, and identity, giving them control over something the outside world could never steal or distort. Every grunt, bark, and glance told a story. Every sound carried history. This language wasn't designed for outsiders, and perhaps that was its strength. It was theirs, untouched, untranslatable, and unbreakable. For brothers whose lives were defined by collapse, this code was their triumph. It carried them through hunger, harassment, and humiliation. It was proof that even in silence, meaning roared louder than words. Filmmakers who truly listened realized this. They stopped laughing and started observing. Over time, they saw language where they once saw chaos. They realized the Whitakers weren't broken. They had simply forged another way. That realization changed everything. The Whitakers' language, misunderstood by millions, became evidence of resilience, of adaptation, of human will refusing to vanish even under the crushing weight of genetic collapse. Inside those guttural cries, there was something universal: the need to be heard, the need to be understood, the need to exist with dignity. The Whitakers' code was their lifeline, their refusal to disappear. What outsiders dismissed as barks of madness were, in truth, survival songs. They were the echoes of men determined to stay connected, to stay human, no matter how violently the world mocked their voices. This was the language of survival, born of silence, strengthened by isolation, perfected in defiance, a code that made the Whitakers impenetrable, reminding the world that even broken voices can speak louder than cruelty. Long before cameras arrived in Odd, the Whitakers had already grown used to the cruelty of the outside world. Their home became a target, a spectacle for strangers who saw them as entertainment rather than men. Teenagers would drive down the dirt roads at night, headlights piercing through the trees. They leaned on horns, shouted insults, and hurled objects at windows, laughing as if tormenting another man's life was sport. Rocks shattered against siding, eggs splattered against doors, and insults echoed into the hills. To outsiders, it was just mischief. To the Whitakers, it was a constant reminder that they were seen as less. Inside those walls, the brothers endured. They had little choice but to absorb humiliation, but as years passed, patience hardened into defiance. Survival meant drawing lines, and those lines were defended with whatever was available. When rocks hit windows, rocks were thrown back. When strangers grew bold, firecrackers lit the night. Every act of harassment pushed the Whitakers deeper into defense mode, forcing them to confront cruelty with their own hands. This wasn't reckless violence. It was survival in a world that offered no protection. The deputies rarely intervened, neighbors couldn't always shield them, so the family relied on grit, instinct, and unflinching determination. Larry Whitaker embodied this spirit. When an outsider threatened harm to his household, Larry acted with the urgency of a soldier on the front line. A rifle raised, a warning delivered, a line no one would cross. Outsiders might call it dangerous, but for Larry it was necessary. When society refused to defend his family, he became defender, protector, judge, and sentry, ensuring no outsider could exploit their vulnerability without consequence. The harassment never fully disappeared. Outsiders remained curious, sometimes cruel. But word spread about confrontations. Teenagers who once mocked learned quickly that stepping too close meant meeting men unafraid to answer with resistance. Each confrontation etched scars. Windows stayed cracked, siding remained dented, but pride was preserved. The Whitakers refused to bow to humiliation. Every defensive act shouted the same message: "We will not be broken." Odd became a battleground of perception. Outsiders arrived seeking spectacle, but insiders knew the truth. This family wasn't helpless. They were men under siege, surviving not only poverty, but the cruelty of a watching world. The siege wasn't only physical, it was emotional. Every horn blast at night reminded them of their difference. Every rock hurled through glass carried a message: you don't belong. Yet still, they stayed. Staying required resilience. Other families might have fled under such constant torment. But the Whitakers dug in, refusing to abandon their ground. Endurance became their weapon, defiance their shield, stubbornness their legacy. Defiance was taught through example. Young boys grew into men understanding that silence didn't mean weakness. When outsiders mocked, you stood tall. When they attacked, you pushed back. This became the rhythm of survival. The world didn't see this side. Viral clips showed quirks, not battles. Few cameras captured the endless harassment or the determination to fight back. But this reality shaped the family more than genetics ever could. The brothers' resilience turned them into legends within Odd. Neighbors saw them not as curiosities, but as warriors of survival. Harassment bred scars, but it also forged men who refused to surrender dignity. Some outsiders came to gawk, expecting submission. Instead, they encountered stares sharper than knives and postures that radiated defiance. Silence became a weapon too, unsettling intruders who expected weakness but found unshakable will. Each rock thrown was a lesson. Each egg splattered became a warning. With every insult endured, the Whitakers grew more impenetrable, more determined to remind the world that humiliation could never erase existence. Their home, patched and weathered, stood as both shelter and fortress. To outsiders, it looked fragile. To those inside, it was unbreakable, a place where defense was more than survival. It was a declaration of manhood. Stories passed through Odd like wildfire. Outsiders had been chased, threatened, repelled. Teenagers dared each other to trespass, but few returned twice. The Whitakers' reputation became protection as much as the rifles on the porch, and yet, behind the defiance, was exhaustion. Living under siege takes a toll. Each insult left marks unseen. Each night of harassment drained spirit. But still, they endured, because surrender was never an option. Imagine enduring decades where your existence itself became a target. No law stepped in. No institution offered relief. Only brothers at your side, rifles within reach, and silence that spoke louder than words. This isolation hardened them. Trust with outsiders was rare, almost impossible. Every visitor was judged with suspicion. The fortress around them was built not just of rifles, but of memories etched with cruelty. Inside the home, the brothers clung to each other. Their private code of sounds and gestures carried meaning outsiders would never understand. When the world mocked them, they turned inward, creating strength no ridicule could touch. Life became a rhythm of survival. Mornings spent in silence, afternoons fending off mockery, nights filled with the echo of harassment. Yet through it all, the Whitakers refused to abandon the only ground they knew. This choice, staying, enduring, became their act of rebellion. The world expected collapse, disappearance, erasure. Instead, they remained visible, stubborn, a reminder that even under siege, dignity can persist when men refuse to yield. Each act of defense rewrote the story. Outsiders wanted to see weakness, but what they found was resistance. Every confrontation forced a reconsideration. Maybe the Whitakers weren't victims at all. They were survivors. Survivors of genetic collapse. Survivors of poverty. Survivors of humiliation. Their story wasn't simply about bloodlines. It was about defiance, the refusal to surrender to cruelty, the insistence on carving dignity from endless mockery. Neighbors respected that resilience. They watched as the family endured and responded. And slowly, a network of protection grew, men willing to step forward, rifles ready, solidarity unspoken but deeply understood. This solidarity created a shield. Outsiders might laugh online, but within Odd, everyone knew the truth. The Whitakers weren't freaks. They were men living under siege, guarding their lives against a relentless, mocking world. The siege defined them, but it didn't break them. Every attack was answered, every insult was endured, and in the end, what remained wasn't defeat, but an unyielding legacy of survival and defiance. Outsiders never truly saw this legacy. They saw barks, stares, and strange mannerisms. What they missed was the courage it took to stand ground in the face of constant harassment, decade after decade, without surrender. The Whitakers' survival under siege is the forgotten chapter, the part hidden behind ridicule. Yet it is this defiance, this refusal to break, that truly defines their story more than any viral video ever could. Their legacy is not just bloodlines twisted by fate. It is rifles at the ready, silence stronger than words, and men who faced siege with stubborn defiance, proving that even mocked lives hold unbreakable strength. And as the siege continued, the Whitakers wrote their truth not in words but in defiance, showing the world that survival is not always about winning. It is about refusing to disappear no matter the odds. On a bitter December night in 2024, a fire erupted in one of the Whitakers' homes. Within minutes, flames consumed wood and metal, leaving nothing but glowing ash and the blackened skeleton of walls. The fire spread fast, fed by years of dry timber and worn electrical lines. By the time neighbors noticed, the home was beyond saving. The Whitakers stood helpless as their world collapsed in smoke. They didn't own much to begin with. Their homes were patched together, cluttered with old couches, rusted stoves, and the constant shuffle of loyal dogs. Yet even in poverty, it was theirs, a fragile sanctuary. When the fire ended, nothing remained but charred beams jutting skyward like broken teeth. Ash drifted across the dirt, coating everything in gray, while silence settled heavy as the family stared at ruin. 6 men and their dogs were forced into a single cramped trailer across the road. The space was suffocating, every corner filled with bedding, food stacked against walls, and clothes draped over sagging chairs. Inside the trailer, air grew thick with smoke residue and damp from overcrowding. Each movement meant brushing shoulders. Each night meant breathing in the same stale heat, survival compressed into a box too small. The loss hit harder than outsiders could imagine. The burned house had been more than shelter. It was a defense against mockery, a shield from headlights, a place where silence felt like safety. Now, each morning, they faced ruins staring back at them. Charred wood reminded them of vulnerability. Every time they stepped outside, the skeletal frame of their past home haunted them, a reminder of fragility. This wasn't just fire damage. It was psychological devastation. The one piece of ground where they felt control was reduced to ash. The fortress, already fragile, now stood visibly broken before their own eyes. Yet even in tragedy, resilience appeared. The brothers didn't scatter. They compressed together inside the trailer, determined to endure. Their dogs lay across narrow floors and their guttural language carried on through cramped walls. It was survival by compression. Too many bodies in too little space. Yet somehow it worked. Meals shared on laps, conversations through barks and grunts, nights endured with patience forged from decades of hardship. The fire stripped dignity, but not brotherhood. Their unity became armor, binding them tighter than before. In loss, they leaned on one another, proving that even when structures collapsed, resilience could rebuild something unseen. Outsiders who visited saw exhaustion etched into faces. The men didn't cry or wail. They sat in silence, staring into ruins, carrying weariness heavier than any flame, the kind only survivors truly understand. The fire was not their first tragedy, but it was among the most visible. Poverty had stripped comfort, harassment stripped peace, genetics stripped speech. Now, fire stripped their last fragile shelter. And yet they endured. Each day brought small acts of resilience. Dogs barked at passing cars, men gathered on porches of the trailer, silence was filled with coded sounds. Life continued even beside ashes. The loss reshaped daily rhythms. Cooking became harder, sleeping became cramped, but adaptation was nothing new. The Whitakers had endured siege, ridicule, and isolation. Fire was another test, another enemy to withstand. What outsiders didn't see was the courage it took to wake each day beside ruins, to see blackened beams where laughter once echoed, to live with constant reminder that safety can vanish overnight. Still, they refused to leave odd. This was their ground, their fortress, their heritage of resilience. Abandoning it meant surrender, and surrender was never an option, no matter how much ash covered their lives. Neighbors spoke quietly of the fire. Some offered scraps of help, others only watched. But within the family, aid was simple. Brothers standing together, dogs circling their feet, silence heavy but unbroken. The trailer became symbol of endurance. Cramped and worn, it represented survival after disaster. Each day spent inside was a testament to resilience, proof that tragedy could scorch walls, but not erase spirit. Think about the weight of that choice. To remain on burned ground, to breathe ashes daily, to refuse escape. That decision wasn't weakness. It was defiance, a declaration that loss wouldn't dictate existence. Outsiders may have pitied them, but pity missed the point. The Whitakers didn't ask for sympathy. They asked only to remain undisturbed, to rebuild in their way, to live with dignity despite destruction. The fire illuminated their vulnerability to the world. Viral images showed devastation, but few captured resilience. Behind charred remains were men still sitting proudly, staring into ruins without bowing their heads to humiliation. Every survivor of disaster knows the silence afterward. For the Whitakers, that silence was familiar, another chapter in a long chain of hardship. Yet within that silence, strength grew, stubborn and unshakable. Survival wasn't glamorous. It was sleeping shoulder to shoulder, eating on laps, speaking in guttural sounds. But each act of endurance was a victory, a reminder that fire could burn wood, but not brotherhood. The dogs played their part too. They barked at night, filling silence with warning. They curled close during cold evenings, offering warmth and loyalty. In their own way, they became guardians of survival. The sight of ruins did not fade. Each sunrise painted black beams orange. Each sunset cast shadows over ash. Yet the Whitakers lived on, enduring with stubbornness stronger than the flames that took their home. The world might see tragedy, but inside odd, men saw resilience. The Whitakers were not defeated. They had been scarred, yes, but they had not been erased. Their survival stood louder than loss. Life inside the trailer carried on with its own rhythm. Conversations in grunts, dogs shifting across floors, meals shared from dented pans. It wasn't comfort, but it was continuity, the heartbeat of existence. Outsiders imagined hopelessness, but hopelessness never defined them. Hardship was familiar, almost expected. The fire was devastating, but it was simply another enemy added to the long list of battles already endured. And so, the Whitakers faced the ashes each morning with quiet defiance. Their world was smaller, harsher, but unbroken. Fire had destroyed walls, but it had not destroyed men who refused to surrender. Even now, the ruins remain a haunting monument. Charred beams still stand across the road, a constant reminder of vulnerability, but also of resilience, proof that even fire could not erase their determination to endure. The Whitakers became a story of survival once again. Fire joined poverty, ridicule, and genetics in the list of trials faced. Yet each trial ended the same. The brothers stood, the fortress endured. This is the paradox of their story. Outsiders saw tragedy, but what truly existed was resistance. Fire consumed wood, but spirit survived. The Whitakers proved once again that their story was never about defeat, and as smoke cleared into memory, the brothers carried on. Ashes underfoot, silence in the air, resilience in their eyes. The fire had destroyed walls, but it could never destroy their unbreakable bond. The Whitakers' story lingers in America's memory, not only because of their appearance in viral videos, but because of what their lives reveal about resilience, cruelty, and the boundaries of human endurance in isolation. Generations of twisted genetics and relentless harassment shaped their existence, but their legacy is not defined by collapse. Instead, it is carved into history as proof that survival is possible even when everything seems impossible. Their name became synonymous with ridicule, yet behind every mocking headline was the unshakable reality that these men refused to vanish. They endured fires, insults, poverty, and endless cruelty while holding their ground. The Whitakers remind us of what happens when society chooses to gawk instead of understand. Outsiders saw entertainment, but insiders saw endurance, a quiet defiance that resisted every attempt to erase their dignity. Their legacy is not just about inbreeding or poverty. It is about loyalty among brothers, about rifles raised to defend, about guttural voices transformed into language, about scars that never stopped them from living. Think about the strength it takes to be mocked daily, to endure siege, to live with genetic collapse, yet still rise each morning and carry on as though defiance itself is survival. They became symbols of Appalachia's forgotten corners, where isolation collides with hardship, and where dignity is defended not with wealth or words, but with silence, rifles, and stubbornness that refuses to bow. In many ways, their story holds a mirror to society. The Whitakers didn't seek fame. Fame invaded them, twisted their reality into spectacle, and left them carrying the weight of endless global judgment. But still, they endured. That endurance is their legacy. While the world laughed, they spoke in barks. While outsiders mocked, they stood their ground. While tragedy struck, they rebuilt in their own way. Their story is a reminder of what humanity looks like when stripped bare of privilege. No comfort, no protection, no mercy from outsiders. Only brotherhood, resilience, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. The Whitakers lived at the edge of society, yet their lives echo universal truths. Every man understands the need to protect dignity, to defend family, to endure hardship without letting the world strip identity. Outsiders reduced them to caricatures, but those who spent time in odd discovered something different. They found loyalty, unity, and resilience in men who had every reason to collapse, yet never surrendered. Even the viral clips, when viewed differently, reveal endurance. Those guttural cries, mocked by millions, were actually proof of connection. That language was legacy, passed between brothers as their shield against the cruelty of outsiders. The Whitakers showed that survival isn't always pretty. Sometimes it is silent stares from porches. Sometimes it is rifles against windows. Sometimes it is the refusal to leave even when surrounded by endless ash. This refusal defined their legend. They never abandoned odd, never surrendered to humiliation, never let outsiders dictate their worth. Their story became one of survival louder than any insult hurled at their name. When fire stripped their shelter, they adapted. When poverty stripped comfort, they endured. When genetics stripped speech, they created new language. Each loss was met not with surrender, but with another form of survival. Their resilience holds lessons for anyone willing to listen. Hardship does not erase humanity. Poverty does not erase dignity. Harassment does not erase identity. Even collapse does not erase survival when men refuse to yield. It is tempting to define them only by genetics, but to do so is to miss the point. Their true legacy lies not in collapse, but in defiance, a story bigger than biology. The Whitakers prove that dignity is not about wealth or speech or status. It is about refusing to let cruelty erase existence. It is about standing in ash and still saying, "We endure." And so, their story becomes a parable of resilience. They show us that survival is not measured by comfort, but by stubbornness, loyalty, and the strength to live when the world calls you unworthy. Their silence speaks louder than words. Their stares carry defiance stronger than speeches. Their language of grunts and barks is a reminder that communication is survival, and survival is the truest form of legacy. They did not choose this fate. They inherited collapse, ridicule, and hardship. Yet despite it all, their story endures. That endurance itself is their greatest gift to history, a legacy unshaken by cruelty. When the world remembers the Whitakers, it should not remember only curiosity. It should remember resilience, the story of men who endured humiliation yet never abandoned dignity, who stood tall despite endless judgment. Each rifle at a window was a reminder. Each stare from a porch was a declaration. Each grunt in silence was defiance. Their entire existence became a fortress against the cruelty of outsiders. Legacies are not chosen. They are forged in hardship. The Whitakers' legacy was born of isolation, cruelty, fire, and survival. It is a story America cannot forget because it reflects society's darkest instincts. Their endurance forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Why did outsiders mock instead of help? Why did cruelty become entertainment? Why was survival ignored until it became a viral spectacle across screens worldwide? In those questions lies the deeper meaning of their legacy. It is not only about who they were, but about who we are and how we treat those living outside accepted lines. The Whitakers may be remembered for collapse, but they should be remembered for defiance. Their story proves that even in the harshest conditions, men can endure, adapt, and carve dignity from endless hardship. It is easy to dismiss them as spectacle, but history will see them as more. They are living proof that survival itself is an act of rebellion against cruelty, judgment, and erasure. Their legacy echoes beyond odd. It challenges outsiders to rethink what survival means, to reconsider the strength required to endure ridicule, to respect the resilience of men who never stopped existing with defiance. The fire, the siege, the ridicule, the poverty, all of it could have erased them. But instead, it wrote their story deeper into history. a legacy of survival stronger than mockery or cruelty. The Whitakers stand as symbols of endurance, not because they sought fame, but because survival became unavoidable. Their legacy is not collapse, but the stubborn persistence of men refusing to be erased. When the world speaks of the Whitakers, it must remember not the ridicule, but the resilience. Their lives are reminders that even the most broken paths can carry strength that refuses to die. Their legacy is the sound of defiance in guttural cries. It is the stare of endurance from porches. It is the silence of resilience that no outsider could ever truly understand or erase. The Whitakers' story does not end with tragedy. It ends with survival. That survival becomes their gift to history, a legacy etched into Appalachia's hills, unyielding as the mountains themselves, eternal in defiance.